What happens when one of Britain's most beloved actors completely loses his composure on live morning television? It only took 35 seconds for Tony Robinson to go from friendly guest to explosive confrontation in what might be the most shocking moment Good Morning Britain has ever broadcast. Before we dive into this absolute chaos, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. We bring you daily videos exposing Hollywood's darkest scandals, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Last night's episode of Good Morning Britain was supposed to be a pleasant chat about Tony Robinson's new historical documentary series. Instead, it turned into an absolute disaster that had viewers across the country stunned. What started as morning television banter between Robinson and co-host Kate Garraway quickly spiraled into one of the most uncomfortable confrontations ever witnessed on British daytime television. The morning began with the typical energy of Good Morning Britain. The studio was bright and bustling, cameras positioned around the iconic desk where Kate Garraway sat alongside her co-hosts. Tony Robinson walked onto the set to warm applause from the small studio audience. He was dressed casually in his signature style, a comfortable sweater and jacket, looking relaxed and ready for what he assumed would be a straightforward promotional appearance. He shook hands with Garraway, exchanged pleasantries with the other hosts, and settled into his chair with his characteristic friendly demeanor. "Tony Robinson, welcome to Good Morning Britain," Garraway said with her trademark warm smile, her voice bright and welcoming. "It's lovely to have you with us this morning. How are you doing?" "I'm very well, Kate, thank you," Robinson replied, his voice cheerful and animated. "It's always a pleasure to be here. I love morning television, even if it means getting up at an ungodly hour. The things we do for our craft, eh?" The studio audience chuckled. Garraway laughed along, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Well, we appreciate you dragging yourself out of bed for us. Now, you've got a fascinating new documentary series starting soon. Tell us all about it." Robinson's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm, leaning forward in his chair. "Oh, it's brilliant, Kate. We've been working on this for over a year now. It's called Britain's Hidden History, and we're exploring stories and events that have been forgotten or overlooked. We're talking about ordinary people who did extraordinary things, communities that shaped the nation but never made it into the history books. It's the kind of history I'm most passionate about." "That sounds wonderful," Garraway nodded, her interest appearing genuine, her hands folded on the desk in front of her. "You've been making history documentaries for decades now. What makes this one special? What sets it apart from your previous work with Time Team and all your other projects?" "What makes it special is that we're not focusing on kings and queens and battles," Robinson explained, his hands gesturing expressively, his passion for the subject evident in every word. "We're looking at the lives of farmers, laborers, merchants, women whose stories were never recorded, the people who actually built this country brick by brick, harvest by harvest. We found some incredible stories in archives all over Britain, tucked away in dusty boxes, forgotten for centuries. Stories that deserve to be told, that need to be told." "Can you give us an example?" Garraway asked, leaning forward with apparent interest. "Something that really surprised you during your research?" Robinson's eyes lit up even more. "Oh, absolutely. We discovered records of a group of women in Yorkshire in the 1600s who essentially ran an entire village's economy while the men were away at war. They organized trade, managed farms, even conducted their own informal court system. It's never been documented in any history book, but it's all there in parish records and merchant ledgers. These women were brilliant, resourceful, and they kept their community alive. That's the kind of story we need to be telling." "Fascinating," Garraway said, nodding appreciatively. "And you visit these actual locations in the series?" "We do," Robinson confirmed enthusiastically. "We go to the sites, we talk to local historians, we sometimes even do a bit of digging ourselves. In one episode, we're in a small village in Wales, where we found evidence of a medieval market that was 10 times larger than anyone knew. The whole economic history of the region has to be rewritten because of what we found. The conversation flowed smoothly for the next several minutes. Robinson discussed filming locations across the UK, from remote Scottish villages where ancient traditions still survived to forgotten corners of Cornwall, where smugglers once operated elaborate networks, to industrial towns in the Midlands where working-class movements were born. He talked about the research process, the months spent in archives, the historians he worked with from universities across the country, and some of the surprising discoveries they made that challenged established historical narratives. He shared an amusing anecdote about getting stuck in mud during a shoot at a medieval site, requiring the entire crew to pull him out with ropes while he clutched a fragment of pottery he'd just found, refusing to let go despite being covered head to toe in muck. Another story involved accidentally disturbing a wasp's nest while filming at a Roman fort, sending the entire crew running and forcing them to abandon the shot for the day. The atmosphere was light and friendly. The hosts were laughing. The audience was engaged. Exactly what morning television should be. "So, Tony," Garraway said, her tone shifting slightly, becoming more measured, the warmth draining from her voice. "I want to ask you about something else that's been in the news recently. You've been quite outspoken on social media about various political issues. Some people have commented that you've become rather vocal about your views. Very vocal, in fact." Robinson's smile flickered momentarily. He adjusted his position in the chair, his body language becoming less relaxed. "Well, I wouldn't say I've become more vocal. I've always had opinions. I've always cared about these things. I just happen to share them now that social media exists. I think it's important for people who have a platform to use it responsibly. But there's been some criticism," Garraway continued, her voice maintaining its friendly tone but with an underlying edge, like a knife wrapped in silk. "Some viewers have said they prefer when entertainers stick to entertainment rather than politics. That they come to you for history and humor, not political commentary. That they want to escape from the constant political noise, not have more of it. How do you respond to that?" The atmosphere in the studio shifted perceptibly, like a change in air pressure before a storm. Robinson's jaw tightened slightly. His hands, which had been gesturing openly, now gripped the armrests of his chair. "How do I respond? I respond by saying that I'm a citizen of this country just like everyone else. I have the right to express my views. I have the responsibility to speak up about things that matter. History and politics are inseparable, Kate. You can't study history without understanding politics, and you can't understand politics without knowing history. They're two sides of the same coin." "Of course," Garraway said, nodding but pressing forward, not letting him off the hook. "But don't you think there's a difference between your professional work and your personal political posts? Some people feel you're using your celebrity status inappropriately, that you're exploiting your position to push an agenda." "Inappropriately?" Robinson repeated his quote, voice taking on an edge, sharpening. "Exploiting? Those are strong words, Kate. I'm using my platform to talk about things that matter. Climate change, education funding, protecting historical sites, supporting public services. These aren't political issues in the traditional sense. They're human issues. They affect everyone, regardless of political affiliation." Garraway leaned back slightly, her expression becoming more challenging, her eyes narrowing. "But they are political issues, Tony. They absolutely are. And when you take strong stances on these topics, when you post multiple times a day about government policies and political decisions, you're potentially alienating parts of your audience. You're potentially damaging your own brand. Don't you worry about that?" "Honestly, Kate, no," Robinson said, his voice firmer now, more resolute. "If people want to stop watching my documentaries because I care about the planet, or education, or preserving our heritage, that's their choice. But I'm not going to be silent about things that matter, just to avoid upsetting people. That's not who I am. That's not who I've ever been. And frankly, I'd lose respect for myself if I did that. The tension was rising now, palpable and uncomfortable. The other hosts exchanged glances, uncertain looks passing between them. The camera operators adjusted their positions, sensing that this was becoming more than a standard interview, that something was shifting. "I'm not suggesting you should be silent," Garraway clarified, though her tone suggested otherwise, a certain edge creeping into her words. "I'm asking if you've considered that constantly posting about politics, multiple times a day, might overshadow your actual work, that people might start seeing you as a political activist rather than a historian and entertainer, that you might be damaging the very platform you're trying to use." Robinson's face was beginning to flush, redness creeping up his neck. And what exactly would be wrong with being seen as someone who cares about more than just entertainment? What's wrong with being an activist for positive change? What's wrong with using whatever influence I have, however small it might be, to advocate for things that will make the world better for our children and grandchildren? "There's nothing wrong with it," Garraway said. But there was a sharpness creeping into her voice now, an edge that cut. "But there's a way to do it. There's a difference between advocacy and what some people see as preaching or lecturing. There's a difference between sharing your views and bombarding people with them constantly." "Preaching?" Robinson's voice rose slightly, his control slipping. "I'm not preaching. I'm expressing opinions. I'm sharing information that I think is important. I'm trying to educate people about issues that will affect their lives. If people interpret that as preaching, that says more about them than it does about me. That says they're not comfortable with being challenged or informed." Garraway's professional demeanor was starting to crack, small fractures appearing in her composed exterior. "Tony, I think you need to understand that your position gives you a responsibility. People look up to you. Families watch your shows together. When you're constantly posting political content, especially content that's quite pointed and sometimes divisive, you're influencing people who might not have all the information, who might not understand the complexity of these issues." "Influencing people?" Robinson's voice was incredulous now, rising in volume and intensity. "That's rich coming from someone who works in media. That's absolutely rich. You influence people every single day with how you frame stories, what you choose to cover, what you choose not to cover, which guests you bring on, what questions you ask them. Don't lecture me about influence when you're literally paid to influence public opinion." The studio went quiet, the silence heavy and oppressive. This had crossed a line, moved beyond professional disagreement into something more personal. Garraway's eyes widened slightly, her professional mask slipping further, revealing genuine anger beneath. "I'm not lecturing you, Tony. I'm having a conversation about responsibility, about being thoughtful with your platform." "No, you're not," Robinson shot back, his voice louder now, echoing through the studio. "You're questioning my right to have and express opinions. You're suggesting I should keep quiet to protect my brand or avoid controversy. You're trying to shame me into silence. That's not having a conversation about responsibility, that's trying to silence me, and I won't have it." "That's absolutely not what I'm doing," Garraway insisted, her voice rising to match his, all pretense of calm professionalism gone now. "I'm asking you to consider the impact of your words, to think about whether your approach is effective or if it's just making people defensive and closed-minded, to question whether you're actually changing minds or just preaching to the converted, making people defensive." Robinson laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and humorless. "Kate, if people get defensive when I say we should protect the environment or fund education properly or preserve our historical heritage, that's their problem, not mine. I'm not responsible for their fragility. I'm not responsible for their unwillingness to face uncomfortable truths." The atmosphere was electric now, charged with tension. The other hosts were frozen, unsure whether to intervene or let this play out. The cameras captured every moment of the escalating confrontation, every flash of anger, every tightened jaw, every clenched fist. That's quite dismissive, Garraway said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. You're essentially saying that anyone who disagrees with you or is put off by your tone or your constant posting is fragile. That anyone who wants to enjoy your work without the political commentary is somehow weak. That's not very inclusive, is it? That's not very tolerant. Don't twist my words, Robinson said sharply, his finger pointing for emphasis. I didn't say people who disagree with me are fragile. I said people who get defensive when confronted with facts and evidence are fragile. There's a difference, a significant difference. If you can't see that, that's on you. But who decides what's a fact? Garraway challenged, leaning forward aggressively. You're presenting your opinions as facts, your interpretations as objective truth, and when people push back or question you, you dismiss them as defensive or uninformed. That's not dialogue. That's not conversation. That's preaching from a pulpit. I'm presenting scientific consensus as facts, Robinson countered, his face reddening further, his voice rising to near shouting levels. I'm presenting documented evidence as facts. I'm presenting the work of thousands of scientists and researchers as facts. Climate change is real. Education funding has been cut dramatically. Historical sites are being destroyed. These aren't opinions, Kate. These are verifiable realities. These are things you can look up and confirm yourself. But the solutions to those problems are political, Garraway pressed, her voice matching his intensity. And that's where people have legitimate disagreements. That's where you're wading into opinion and political ideology, whether you want to admit it or not. So what? Robinson's voice echoed through the studio, loud enough to make some crew members flinch. I'm not allowed to have opinions on solutions? I'm supposed to just point out problems and then shut up? I'm supposed to say, the house is on fire but not suggest we call the fire brigade? That's absurd. That's completely absurd. Garraway leaned forward, her expression hardening into something cold and judgmental. I'm saying, you might want to consider that your constant political posting is divisive, that it's creating more conflict than productive dialogue, that it's making enemies when you could be building bridges. Divisive? Robinson stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, the sound jarring in the tense atmosphere. You want to talk about divisive? How about bringing me on your show under the pretense of discussing my documentary and then ambushing me with political questions designed to make me look bad? How about that for divisive? How about that for dishonest? The studio erupted in tension, the atmosphere thick and suffocating. Garraway stood as well, her professional composure completely gone now, her face flushed with anger. This isn't an ambush, Tony. These are legitimate questions that viewers have been asking, questions that deserve answers. Viewers? Robinson's voice was sharp, cutting. Or producers? Or you personally? Because this feels very planned. This feels very calculated. This feels like you decided before I even got here that you were going to have a go at me, that you were going to put me in my place. That's not true, Garraway protested, but her voice wavered slightly, uncertainty creeping in. Isn't it? Robinson challenged, taking a step toward the desk. Then why bring it up at all? Why not just talk about the documentary like we agreed, like your producers told my people we would? Why turn this into an interrogation about my social media presence? Why make this about me instead of about the work? Because it's relevant, Garraway insisted, her voice rising defensively. Because your audience wants to know where you stand on these issues. Because your behavior affects your credibility. My audience knows where I stand, Robinson said, his voice rising again, his hands gesturing wildly. I've been very clear, very vocal, as you pointed out. What this is really about is you trying to get me to either back down from my positions or say something controversial that you can use as a headline. Either way, you win. Either way, you get your moment. That's ridiculous, Garraway said. But she was clearly rattled now, her confidence shaken. We're trying to have an honest conversation. We're trying to understand your perspective. An honest conversation? Robinson's laugh was harsh and broken. Kate, honest conversations don't start with accusations. They don't start with telling someone they're too political or too vocal or too divisive. They start with respect and genuine curiosity and good faith. This has none of those things. This has been an attack from the start. The other hosts finally tried to interject. Ben Shepherd spoke up, his voice attempting to be calming, trying to restore some semblance of control. Let's all take a breath here. I think we've got our wires crossed somewhere. Let's reset and start over. No, Robinson said firmly, turning to face him, his expression hard. The wires aren't crossed, Ben. They're perfectly clear. Kate came at me with an agenda, with a plan to make me look bad or defensive or unreasonable, and I'm not playing along. I'm not going to sit here and be scolded for giving a damn about the world, for caring about something beyond my own comfort and success. Garraway's face was flushed now, red creeping up from her neck. Nobody's scolding you, Tony, but you're being incredibly defensive. If you can't handle questions about your public behavior, maybe you shouldn't be so public about it. Maybe you should think twice before posting every thought that enters your head. My public behavior? Robinson's voice cracked with anger. You mean caring about things? Speaking up about issues? That's my crime? That's what you're upset about? I'm not upset, Garraway said, though her voice suggested otherwise. I'm trying to understand why you feel the need to be so confrontational about everything. I'm confrontational? Robinson spread his arms wide. You brought me here to talk about history and then started grilling me about politics, and I'm confrontational? The cognitive dissonance is astounding. Look, Garraway said, her voice hardening. If you can't handle a few questions without getting upset, that's your issue. This is what we do here. We ask tough questions. Tough questions? Robinson shook his head in disbelief. These aren't tough questions. They're gotcha questions. They're designed to make me look bad, regardless of how I answer. And I'm not playing that game. Then maybe you should leave, Garraway said suddenly, her voice cold. The words hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Robinson stared at her for a moment, his expression a mixture of shock and anger. You're kicking me off? I'm saying if you can't have a civil conversation, then perhaps this isn't working, Garraway said, though she looked somewhat surprised by her own words. A civil conversation? Robinson's voice was dangerously quiet now. I came here in good faith. I came here to talk about my work, to share something I'm proud of. Instead, you attacked my character and questioned my right to have opinions. And now you're throwing me off for defending myself? That's not what's happening, Garraway insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. That's exactly what's happening, Robinson said, reaching for his microphone. And you know what? I'm happy to leave. I don't need to sit here and be insulted on live television. He pulled off his microphone pack with sharp, angry movements. You know what the really sad thing is, Kate? I actually respected you. I thought you were better than this. But this ambush, this attempt to paint me as some kind of extremist for caring about education and the environment, it's beneath you. Or at least I thought it was. Garraway opened her mouth to respond, but Robinson wasn't finished. And for the record, he continued, his voice shaking with emotion, I will never apologize for using my platform to speak up about things that matter. I will never apologize for caring more about the future of our planet and our children than I do about offending people who'd rather I just shut up and entertain them. If that makes me too political, so be it. Tony, please. Ben Shepherd tried again. Let's not end it like this. It's already ended, Robinson said, his voice firm but tired. Kate ended it when she decided to turn a promotional interview into a political hit piece. He turned to face the camera directly, speaking to the viewers. I'm sorry you didn't get to hear about the documentary. It's really quite good, and it tells important stories about forgotten British history. But apparently, that's not what this show wanted to talk about today. With that, Tony Robinson turned and walked off the Good Morning Britain set. His footsteps echoed in the suddenly silent studio. The cameras followed him as he disappeared through the studio doors, the sound of them closing reverberating through the space. Kate Garraway stood at the desk, her face a mixture of anger, shock, and perhaps the smallest hint of regret. Her co-hosts sat frozen, unsure how to proceed. The small studio audience was completely silent, some people with their hands over their mouths in shock. Garraway looked at the camera, opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. She looked down at her notes, shuffled them unnecessarily, then looked back up. "Right," she said finally, her voice strained and unsteady. "We need to take a break. We'll be back in a moment." The screen cut to commercial, but not before capturing one final shot of the empty chair where Tony Robinson had been sitting moments before, and Kate Garraway's face, her professional mask cracked, and her expression difficult to read. The Good Morning Britain studio, usually a place of controlled chaos and carefully managed discussions, had just witnessed something raw and unscripted. What should have been a pleasant, promotional chat had turned into a full-scale confrontation that ended with one of Britain's most beloved television personalities walking off in disgust. Tony Robinson was gone. The interview was over. And Good Morning Britain would have a lot to answer for.